Everybody stop what you're doing and walk, do not run, toward the east doors, right now.
Hey, you cannot do that. I have $4,000 of product on that table, How?
And you'll have it back in 20 minutes if you walk right now instead of arguing with me. East doors, everyone in aisles 1 through 4. West doors for 5 through 8.
They're not opening. The doors aren't opening.
Somebody prop the west doors wide right now and reroute everybody through there instead, Tang. Go, go! Come on, come on.
Is he stealing something? Is that guy stealing something?
I'm fixing a door. Keep walking. Sir, you can't be back there. That's a restricted panel.
Let go of my arm or help me pull this housing. Those are the only two options that end well for you in the next 10 seconds. I don't know you. You don't need to know me. Grab that bar, pull when I say pull. Ezra tore the cover free, the jagged edge slicing his palm, and threw it aside. Underneath, a release bar sat bolted flush against the strike plate. He hooked 2 fingers through the gap. Pull! The guard's hand closed over the bar next to his. Metal tore free with a crack loud enough to carry over the crowd noise, the bar snapping back hard enough to leave a welt across Ezra's wrist, and the east doors swung wide, the bottleneck breaking apart in a rush of bodies that didn't slow down to say thank you. Go, both banks, keep moving, don't stop for anything. Ezra was back at the mic within seconds, breathing hard, a thin line of blood welling along one knuckle that he didn't have time to notice yet. How do you even know what you're looking at? Someone else shouted, still moving. Not now, go. You can't just... I can and I am, and you're going to thank me for it later. Move. Is this a drill? Nobody told us there was a drill. It's not a drill. Keep walking, keep your voice down, and don't stop to ask me again. I need my mouth free for the next 90 people, not just you. Feet started moving before minds fully caught up, the particular obedience of people who couldn't see danger but could hear that someone else already had. Denise grabbed her cash box and nothing else, falling into line without another word. A vendor 2 booths down asked his neighbor what was happening. Neither of them knew, and neither of them stopped walking to find out. Ezra kept the mic close, counting bodies against the shape of the hall he'd spent 2 days learning by cable run alone, watching the aisles for anyone frozen instead of moving. West aisle, that's you too, ma'am. Keep going. You're doing exactly the right thing. Is there a fire? I don't smell smoke. There's no fire. Keep walking. I'll explain everything once you're outside. I promise you that. What am I supposed to tell my staff back at the booth? Tell them to walk faster and ask questions after. That's what I'm telling everyone, including you. It took 6 minutes. Ezra was the last person out of the exhibition hall, walking backward through the door with his eyes still scanning the rows of half-built booths, phone already against his ear, the numbers running through his head with a precision that felt less like memory and more like muscle he hadn't used in 7 years. 90, he told the venue security supervisor waiting outside, breathing harder than he wanted to admit. That's everybody. I counted twice. There's a bag under the folding table by booth 41, back corridor side, near the HVAC return. Don't send anyone in there. Call the Bureau field office, not the local PD bomb squad. Tell them it's positioned for dispersal, not just wait. How do you know that? I'll explain later. Call them now. Sir, I need you to step back with everyone else, a young officer said, hand out, not unkind, just doing his job. I'm not going near the bag. I need 30 seconds with whoever's running the response when they get here, and then I'll step back as far as you want. That's not really how this works. It's exactly how this works when the person who found it might be the only one who can tell your team what they're walking into. Ask your supervisor. I'll wait right here. The officer didn't argue further, mostly because a black SUV was already pulling up at the curb, and the woman who got out of it moved with the specific economy of someone who'd done this more times than she could count and had stopped being impressed by her own speed a long time ago. They called. 19 minutes after that, a federal response team moved through the same doors Ezra had just emptied, methodical in a way that made the crowd on the sidewalk go quiet without anyone telling them to. A voice crackled over someone's radio, loud enough for the people nearest it to hear. Confirmed device viable. Good call, whoever made it. Denise Farrow, still holding her cash box against her chest, looked over at Ezra like she was seeing him for the first time. You just said that like it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't, entirely. Ezra didn't elaborate. He watched the response team's van instead, hands in his pockets to stop them from shaking where people could see. The venue's head of security found him 20 minutes later, clipboard forgotten under one arm. "You did everything right, sir. Everything. I don't know how you even clocked that thing under a table from 15 feet away." Long story, not one I tell for free. He meant it as a joke. Nobody laughed, because nobody yet understood how true it actually was. That evening, Silas Poole found his father at the kitchen table, running a thumb along the worn edge of a leather notebook Ezra had owned longer than his son had been alive. "Mrs. Alvarez said there was a bomb scare at your work today." Not exactly a scare. There was a real one, and 90 people got out before it mattered. Ezra closed the notebook without opening it fully, an old habit his son had stopped questioning years ago. "You stopped a bomb." "I stopped 90 people from being anywhere near one." "That's not quite the same thing, but I'll let you have the shorter version tonight." He pulled his son into a one-armed hug. "I'm okay. Everybody's okay. That's the whole headline." That night, after Silas had gone to bed, Ezra sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time, the notebook open in front of him, but unread, his hand still not entirely steady. He hadn't felt this particular kind of tired in 7 years. Not the tired of a long day, but the tired of a body that had spent itself on something it used to be trained for and hadn't used since. He thought, more than once that night, about calling someone from his old life to talk it through, a former supervisor, a colleague who might still remember him fondly enough to pick up the phone. He decided against it each time. 7 years of silence wasn't the kind of thing you broke over a single good day, no matter how strange and enormous that day had turned out to be. The Bureau's official statement, released the next morning, ran 4 sentences long and named no one. An alert individual reported the item, allowing full evacuation of the venue prior to Bureau response. No injuries were reported. The device has been rendered safe. The investigation is ongoing. It read like it had been built specifically to keep a name out of print. And for exactly 1 day, it worked. By the second morning, a local reporter had traced Ezra's identity through a venue staff list, and the story that ran carried his name under a headline that felt, for one clean news cycle, like nothing but good news. Local AV technician credited with saving dozens at Harborview. The trouble started with a phone call from a different reporter entirely, 2 days later, while Ezra was coiling cable in his garage. "Mr. Poole, I'm doing a follow-up piece. Can you confirm the length of time you spent working for the federal government before your current job?" Ezra set the cable down slowly. "I'm sorry. Who told you I worked for the government?" "I was hoping you could confirm that for me." "I'd like to know who told you that before I confirm anything." The reporter didn't answer directly, and the not answering told Ezra more than a straight response would have. Regina Ashwood hadn't slept well in 3 nights, and it had nothing to do with guilt. Or, that was what she kept telling herself in the mirror each morning before she left for the field office. That Tuesday, a call had come in, flagged urgent and specific. An item reported inside the federal courthouse downtown, credible enough on its face that she'd had exactly 4 minutes to decide where her one available K-9 unit needed to be. Harborview had run a dozen years without a single credible threat. The courthouse call was active, named, and current. She pulled the dog off Harborview's rotation and sent it downtown. The courthouse call turned out to be a coat left on a bench by a defense attorney running late for a hearing. Ashwood found that out at 9:40 that morning, 40 minutes after the fact, standing in a hallway that smelled like burnt coffee, and felt her stomach drop in a way relief was supposed to prevent, not cause. Nobody at the courthouse had been in danger for even a minute. 90 people at Harborview had been 40 minutes away from having no coverage at all, and had it not been for a sound technician who happened to be running cable through the one corridor that mattered, at the 1 hour that mattered, they might have found out exactly how dangerous that gap could get. She'd told herself standing in that hallway that the numbers still worked out in her favor. A coat versus a confirmed device. A false alarm resolved versus a catastrophe narrowly avoided by someone else's attention instead of her own planning. She did not let herself finish that sentence out loud to anyone, because she already knew how it would sound if she did. Harborview's never had a credible threat in a dozen years, she told her supervisor 2 days after the story broke, before he'd even asked the question out loud. The courthouse call came in as active and specific. I made the call any of you would have made with the information I had that morning. Her supervisor didn't disagree with the decision. What he asked instead was whether the decision, and the 40-minute gap it created, was going to become public before she found a way to control how it was framed. That question was the one Regina Ashwood couldn't sit with. 2 nights later, she called a reporter she'd worked with before, off the record, and planted a question instead of an accusation, the way people do when they want a fire lit without their own fingerprints on the match. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," she said. "I'm saying it's worth asking how a sound technician knew exactly where to look in exactly the one window when our coverage happened to be thin. That's not an accusation. That's a question a competent reporter should already be asking." The headline ran 2 mornings later. Who is the man who found the device? And how did he know where to look? 2 federal agents came to Ezra's door on a Thursday morning. Polite, unhurried, badges out before either of them said a word. "This is voluntary, Mr. Poole. We'd just like to talk." And if I said no? Neither of them moved to answer, and the badges did the talking instead. The interview room was small, fluorescent, and Regina Ashwood sat across from him herself. A folder closed in front of her that she left untouched for the first several minutes, as if opening it too soon might undercut whatever she was building toward. "Walk me through your employment history prior to your current work." "I worked for the Bureau, civilian analyst, not an agent. I evaluated suspicious item reports and coordinated with K9 explosives units nationally. I left 7 years ago." "And in that role, you'd have had access to how sweep rotations and scheduling gaps work across different sites." "In a general sense, not for Harborview specifically. I'd never worked that venue. But you'd understand, better than an ordinary technician would, that a 40-minute coverage gap is the kind of thing that exists and matters." Ashwood finally opened the folder, not to read from it, just to have it open. "An ordinary technician doesn't know a gap like that exists. Someone with your specific background does. I found a bag that looked wrong sitting 6 feet from an HVAC return in a corridor I'd been running cable through for 2 straight days. I didn't need a career at the Bureau to notice that. I needed to be standing there, which I was because it was my job to be standing there." "That's a very clean explanation." "It's the true one. Those aren't always the same thing to you people, apparently, but they're the same thing to me." "Then help me understand something else. In your 7 years since leaving, have you maintained any contact with anyone still inside K9 program scheduling?" "No." "Anyone with access to sweep rotation systems at Harborview or any other federal facility?" "No. I run sound and lights for corporate events, Agent Ashwood. I haven't spoken to anyone from my old life in years on purpose because that life ended with someone dead, and I didn't feel entitled to keep the parts of it that were easy." That answer sat in the room a moment longer than either of them expected it to. Ashwood closed the folder again. "You're not under arrest, Mr. Poole. You're also not free to leave the building right now." Ezra sat with that sentence a long moment, feeling the particular cold of a room designed to make a person feel like the walls had already decided something the mouths in it hadn't said yet. Bridget Doyle arrived 4 hours later, federal defense attorney, unbothered by fluorescent lighting or long silences. She'd taken the case on a phone call from Ezra's neighbor, who'd heard the news and tracked down her number through a cousin who worked in the county clerk's office, the kind of chain of small kindnesses that only shows up when someone's genuinely in trouble. "Mr. Poole, I'm going to ask you not to say another word to anyone in this building until I've read everything they have, and then I'm going to get you out of here." She set her bag down across from Ashwood's now empty chair, like she was staking a claim to the room itself. "How long have you been in this specific chair?" "About 29 hours. "Have they fed you?" "No. They're required to. I'll deal with that first, on principle, before we deal with anything else." She got Ezra released within another 7 hours, on grounds. She explained to him plainly in the parking garage afterward. "They're holding you as a material witness. Here's what that actually means in plain terms. They haven't charged you with anything. There's no crime on paper. What there is instead is a legal category that lets them keep you close, physically, because they've decided your testimony might matter to a case later, which means no trial date, no formal charge for us to fight in front of a judge, and no clean moment where I get to stand up and argue you're innocent, because officially, nobody's claiming you're guilty of anything at all. So there's no crime. Just a room they can put me in whenever they want. And no way for you to prove I shouldn't be in it." That's close to right, and it's exactly as unfair as it sounds. It's also rare enough, and ugly enough when it hits the papers, that I'm going to make it very expensive for them to keep using it on you starting tonight. What does expensive mean in this context? It means every hour you're not free costs them a headline they don't want, and I intend to make sure of that personally. Doyle walked him through the release paperwork line by line before he signed anything, refusing to let him skim it the way exhausted people usually did. This says you're free to go. It does not say you're cleared of anything, because officially, there was never anything to clear you of in the first place. That's the trick of this whole category of detention. You can walk out of this building today and still spend the next month with your name attached to a federal investigation, and there's no form either of us can sign that fixes that part. So what actually changes? Tonight, you get to sleep in your own bed. Tomorrow, I start making noise publicly about how a witness with nothing to hide got held for 36 hours on a theory that's already falling apart under its own weight. That's the part I can control. Ha was released, but not cleared, barred from leaving the metro area, his name now permanently searchable beside the words federal investigation. And by the following morning, 3 separate venues had called Ezra's booking agent to cancel contracts nobody would explain out loud. I fought for the Castellane corporate account, his agent told him over the phone, sounding genuinely apologetic. They wouldn't say why exactly, just that they'd seen the news and needed to go a different direction for now. I don't know how to argue with a sentence that vague. You can't. I've been trying to argue with sentences exactly that vague for a week. I'll keep pushing the smaller bookings. Nobody local wants to be the first to bring you back, but somebody will, and once one does, the rest tend to follow. I appreciate you trying. I believe you for what it's worth. For what that's worth to a mortgage, I know it's not much. Nobody said why, he told Doyle over the phone that evening, staring at a cancellation email on his laptop. Nobody has to. That's 2 months of rent gone in one phone call, and it's not even the worst part of my week. Silas found the story himself 2 days later on a friend's tablet during recess, a headline with his father's name sitting under the words, "Person of Interest," in a font too small for a 9-year-old to fully understand and too large for him to miss. Is this about your dad? His friend Cody asked, already regretting having pulled it up, watching Silas's face change in real time. I don't know, maybe it has his name. It says he's a person of interest. That sounds bad. I don't know what it means. Silas handed the tablet back, hands not quite steady, and didn't say anything else for the rest of recess, turning the unfamiliar phrase over in his head the way his father turned pages in that old notebook, like there might be something underneath it if he just looked long enough. They called you a person of interest, he said at dinner, pushing food around his plate before the words came out. What does that mean, Dad? Then quieter, not looking up. Are we going to have to move? I heard you on the phone about the rent. Ezra set his fork down. It means somebody thinks knowing too much makes me dangerous instead of useful. I don't agree. He held his son's eyes steady, the way he'd learned to hold a room's attention through a microphone. We're not moving. I'll figure out the rent before I let that happen. That part's my job, not yours. But what if you can't? Then I'll figure out a different way. I've been figuring out rooms full of scared people my whole life, one way or another. I'm not going to stop now, and definitely not for you. I could get a paper route. You're 9. Dexter at school has one. He makes decent money. Despite everything, Ezra laughed, the first real one in days. I appreciate the offer. Let's put a pin in the paper route as a last resort. He reached over and ruffled his son's hair. Eat your dinner. I've got this part. That's still my job, even on a bad week. Tobias Marchetti called Bridget Doyle's office 9 days after the interrogation, unprompted, his voice carrying the particular anger of a man who'd been waiting for someone to ask him the right question. I was the K9 handler pulled off Harborview that morning. I've been waiting for somebody to ask me about it, and nobody has, so I'm calling you instead. Tell me everything, Doyle said, already reaching for a legal pad. That reassignment order had Ashwood's name on it, dated 4 days before anybody found that bag. Not the morning of. This wasn't a snap call made in a crisis. The courthouse tip came in that morning, sure, but the order pulling my unit off Harborview's regular rotation was already sitting in the system days earlier, buried under routine paperwork nobody reads twice. She's telling people it was a same-morning judgment call. It wasn't only that. Some of it was already decided. Doyle sat with that a moment. Can you get me that order? I can get you better than that. I can get you the dispatch company's own logs. We don't run our own scheduling anymore. Northgate K9 Logistics handles it under contract, and their system timestamps everything independent of anybody at the Bureau. Ashwood can't edit what Northgate recorded even if she wanted to. Why are you doing this? You could lose your job for talking to me. I could. Marchetti's voice hardened. I've spent 6 years training dogs to find things people don't want found. I'm not about to spend my 7th year pretending I didn't notice the one thing my own agency didn't want found. That man evacuated 90 people with his voice and a set of speakers. My dog and I should have been in that hallway that morning, and we weren't. And somebody decided the easiest way to handle that fact was to make it look like his problem instead of hers. Regina Ashwood, informed by her own supervisor that a K-9 handler had gone to the press's attorney, sat in her office a long time before she picked up the phone to call her legal counsel. If I walk this back now, I'm not just losing my job. I'm confirming every reporter's theory that we let a scheduling shortcut sit for days and then panicked when it caught up with us. Is that theory wrong? She didn't answer that question either, which told her counsel everything he needed to know. I have a K-9 handler talking to opposing counsel, she said instead, staring at a wall map of the region she'd stopped really seeing an hour ago. If I get ahead of it now, own the scheduling decision publicly, this ends as a story about triage under pressure. If I wait for Marchetti's version to leak first, it ends as a story about a cover-up. Those are not the same ending. Then get ahead of it. And admit I built a case against an innocent man to buy myself 2 more weeks of looking competent? She finally looked away from the map. I know how that sentence sounds. I said it out loud specifically so I'd hear how it sounds. I'm still not ready to say it to a camera. Give me a few more days. Her counsel didn't answer that either, and the silence this time was its own kind of warning. They've pulled your old case file, Doyle told Ezra a week later, sliding a subpoena notice across her desk. The one from before you left the bureau. I need to know what's in it before they get to frame it for you in a room with a camera running. Ezra turned the leather notebook over once in his hands, the same motion he'd been making without noticing for 7 years. There's a boy who deserves better than being a footnote in somebody else's argument. His name was Hollis. I should tell Silas that much, at least, before I tell you the rest. That night, at the kitchen table, he gave his son the smaller version first. Before I did sound and lights, I used to help decide which suspicious things were actually dangerous and which ones weren't. I wasn't always right. Once I was wrong in a way I never got to fix, and that's part of why I left. What happened? I'll tell you the whole thing soon, not tonight. Tonight I just wanted you to know that part exists, so it doesn't feel like a secret if it comes up. It came up 3 nights later, alone, in the quiet of his own kitchen. The notebook opened to a page he hadn't reread in years. 7 years earlier, a report had come across Ezra's desk describing an unattended case left near a mall service corridor. Weight, positioning, and behavioral indicators all scored against a federal threat assessment matrix that had been refined over decades of data. Ezra remembered the exact chair he'd been sitting in, the exact time stamped on the report, 2:14 in the afternoon. A Tuesday. No different from 100 other Tuesdays he'd spent running the same numbers on the same kind of case. The math said low risk deprioritized, scheduled for a routine sweep rather than an emergency response. Ezra had run the assessment himself, checked it twice against the matrix, and signed off exactly as the protocol required. He remembered thinking, almost idly, that he should go say hello to the site security guard before he left for the day, the way he usually did during a walkthrough. Hollis Ferris, 51 years old, 3 years from a pension, the kind of man who kept a photo of his dog taped inside his locker door and asked Ezra every single visit whether the Bureau ever let people bring a K-9 partner home for good once it retired. He hadn't gone to say hello that day. He'd had a flight to catch for another site visit, and the low-risk assessment meant there was nothing urgent left to check, so he'd left the mall 40 minutes earlier than usual. The device detonated 4 hours later, a small charge, poorly built, but close enough to a maintenance closet where Hollis was finishing his rounds. Hollis didn't survive the night. Ezra found out on his layover, standing at a gate in a different city, a missed call, and then a second one from a number he didn't recognize, and then the specific silence of a supervisor's voice on the third call, choosing each word like it might detonate too if handled wrong. The math said low risk, Ezra said out loud to no one. 7 years and 1 kitchen table later, the math was the best anybody had at the time. I ran the numbers exactly the way I was trained to. Hollis still isn't here. I've never found a way to make both of those things sit quietly next to each other, and I don't think I ever will. The threat assessment matrix was revised 8 months after Hollis's death. The scoring thresholds tightened in ways that would have flagged that same device as high priority under the new rules. A quiet internal confirmation that Ezra's original call had been correct under the standard that existed at the time. Nobody outside the Bureau ever knew the matrix had changed because of what happened that night. Ezra knew. It hadn't made the nights easier. He'd resigned 4 months later, without a complaint filed, without a word to anyone about why, and started running cable for other people's events instead, in rooms where the worst thing that could go wrong was a blown fuse. He sat with the notebook a long time that night before he found the page he was actually looking for. A routine entry dated 9 days before the Harborview incident, in his own handwriting, made for reasons that had nothing to do with anything sinister. Rear corridor traffic pattern, cable run conflict, K9 sweep window inconsistent, flag for venue ops, he read aloud, the ordinary shape of the words almost funny against everything that had happened since. I wrote that because I was worried about tripping over a dog mid-sweep while I was laying cable, not because I suspected a single thing, because noticing patterns was my job long before it was anybody's evidence. He brought the notebook to Doyle the next morning. She read the entry twice, then looked up at him with something close to relief. This is dated well before the incident. This is boring, ordinary, entirely unrelated to anything sinister dated. That's exactly the kind of evidence that wins a case like this. Not because it's dramatic, but because nobody could have faked being bored on a specific Tuesday that far in advance. Is it enough on its own? On its own, it's a start. Paired with Marchetti's account and the dispatch logs he mentioned, it stops being one man's convenient notebook and starts being 3 independent sources that all say the same boring, unglamorous thing. You noticed a scheduling pattern because it was your job to notice patterns. Full stop. Days before anyone had a reason to suspect anything at all. Doyle photocopied the page carefully, handling the notebook itself like it mattered more than the words on it. I want the original entered as evidence, not just the copy. Juries trust handwriting they can see was never meant for them. Northgate K9 Logistics Independent Dispatch records arrived at Doyle's office the following week, subpoenaed and unedited, confirming exactly what Marchetti had said. The reassignment order pulling coverage from Harborview had been entered into the system 4 days before the incident, under Ashwood's authorization, filed as routine reallocation rather than emergency response. Our dispatch logs are contractually independent of the requesting agency, the company's compliance officer stated in writing to Doyle's formal request. Nobody at the Bureau has editing access to records once they're time-stamped in our system. 2 weeks after that, forensic analysis of the device's timer housing came back from the Bureau's own lab, and it was this piece of evidence, more than any other, that finally cracked the case wide open. The partial prints recovered didn't match Ezra Poole. They matched a man the Bureau had already been quietly tracking for 8 months in connection with an entirely separate pattern of threats across 3 states, a case that had nothing to do with Harborview until the moment it suddenly explained everything about it. The prints on the timer housing belong to someone your own task force has been building a file on since before any of this happened, Doyle told the Bureau's regional counsel, sliding the report across a conference table. Just not for this incident. Until now. We'll need time to verify the match independently before any public statement. Take the time. My client's already given you 6 weeks of his life for free. A few more days of verification isn't going to bankrupt anyone but him, and I intend to say that publicly if it drags on much longer. Regina Ashwood read the same report in her own office an hour later, alone, and didn't call anyone for a long time. New evidence doesn't erase that my question was reasonable at the time I asked it, she told her supervisor when he finally called her. It might not erase the question, he said. It's going to erase a lot of other things, though. The night before the story broke publicly, Silas found his father at the kitchen table again, notebook closed in front of him, untouched for once. Is it almost over? I think it's close. I don't get to promise you that, though. Ezra reached across and rested a hand on his son's shoulder. I only get to promise I'm not going anywhere while we wait. The headline that ran 3 days later carried none of the ambiguity of the ones before it. Bureau traced device to different suspect. Poole cleared of suspicion. It didn't undo the 6 weeks that had come before it. It did, finally, stop the phone from ringing with cancellations instead of apologies. Denise Farrow called him the same afternoon. The story ran, her voice warm in a way it hadn't been since the morning he'd sent her out of the exhibition hall with nothing but a cash box. I read it 3 times before I believed it, she said. I want you to know I never doubted you. Not once. Not even when the story got ugly. A man who stops mid-sentence to make sure I've got my cash box and not my whole inventory isn't a man who plants anything. I know people, Ezra. That's not who you are. I appreciate you saying that. Not everyone did. Then everyone else is wrong, and I'll say so to anybody who asks. I've already told 2 reporters that myself. She paused, Come by my booth next time there's a fair. I'll comp you a coffee mug or something ridiculous. Least I can do for the man who got 90 of us out in 6 minutes. I might take you up on that. Harborview rescheduled its postponed job fair award ceremony for the following month, and venue management, in a gesture that felt more like liability management than gratitude, asked the Bureau to provide visible security for the reopening. Regina Ashwood volunteered to oversee it personally, over the quiet objection of a supervisor who thought it wiser, given everything, to send someone with a cleaner recent record. I put a man's life on hold for 6 weeks because I was afraid of what one scheduling decision would look like in print, she told him. I'm not going to hide from the next event at the same venue because I'm afraid of what showing up will look like too. Let me do this one properly. Full K-9 sweep, no exceptions this time, she told her team that morning, standing in the same corridor where everything had started. I want to be the one standing here when it goes right. Ezra was there too, hired informally by the job fair's new coordinator to consult on venue safety after everything that had happened, an irony nobody involved found particularly funny, least of all him. 40 minutes into the ceremony, a second device was found, tucked behind a vending machine in the north corridor, close enough to the same man's pattern that the Bureau would later confirm it as a second attempt by the same suspect the forensic evidence had already named. A man who, it would later come out, had been watching news coverage of Ashwood's public rehabilitation tour with something like resentment, unwilling to let a federal agent walk away from his work looking competent. The alarm went up fast, faster than the crowd could clear, and in the scramble that followed, Ashwood's own security perimeter, hastily formed, well-intentioned, badly positioned by agents who'd trained for crowd control more than for containment, sealed off the one corridor she'd been standing in when the alert went out. Radios crossed each other. Someone shouted a code word nobody outside the unit understood. For a handful of seconds that felt considerably longer, nobody in charge of the response actually knew where their own commanding agent was. Device confirmed. North corridor. A voice crackled across the radio channel Ezra happened to be standing close enough to hear. Agent Ashwood is still inside. The exit's blocked by her own perimeter. Ezra didn't think about the 6 weeks. He didn't think about the interrogation room, or the leaked headline, or the rent he'd almost couldn't cover. He was already moving. I know that corridor better than anyone in this building right now, he told the security lead blocking the main hallway, already breathing hard from the run across the exhibition floor. I've been in it for 3 days straight. Let me through. Sir, I can't authorize. You don't need to authorize me. I'm a consultant on this venue's payroll as of this morning, and I'm the only person here who knows the service route around that perimeter. Let me through. Sir, this area is restricted, a second officer started, and the security lead beside him cut in before Ezra had to argue his case twice. Let him through. He's the consultant. And he's right that none of us know that service route the way he does. Ezra was already moving, counting doors the way he'd counted people 6 weeks earlier. The same corridor, the same corner where his notebook had flagged a cable conflict days before any of this began. He found Ashwood 2 minutes later, pressed against a locked service door, radio dead, the perimeter her own team had built now sealing her inside instead of protecting the room. This way. Ezra grabbed a fire door release he'd noticed sitting loose in its housing during his walkthrough for this very ceremony 2 mornings earlier, the kind of small maintenance gap he'd made a habit of clocking wherever he worked, now, for once, working in someone's favor. Don't argue with me right now, just move. Why would you? Ashwood started and stopped herself, already moving. Because I know this corridor and you don't have time for the other question. They came out into open air 40 seconds before the response team finished clearing the device, both of them breathing hard, neither one able to speak right away. Everybody's out, Ezra finally said. You're out. Ashwood didn't answer right away, still catching her breath, one hand braced against the wall like she needed it to stay upright. I was wrong about you, she said finally, quiet enough that only he could hear it. I don't know if that fixes anything. It doesn't. Ezra looked at her a long moment, catching his own breath now too. But you said it to my face instead of burying it in a press release next week. That's not nothing. She nodded, slow, and didn't try to say anything more elaborate than that. Some apologies didn't need decorating to land. The formal exoneration, when it finally came through the following week, arrived as a single-page letter from the Bureau's regional office. Every allegation dropped, every restriction lifted, written in careful language that avoided admitting fault while making the outcome unambiguous. Doyle read it out loud in her office, then set it down and looked at Ezra for a long moment. You could sue. Wrongful detention, defamation from the leak, lost income from the canceled contracts. I could build a real case. I know. Do you want to? Ezra thought about it longer than either of them expected. No, I want my name off every list it's currently on, and I want to go back to work. I've spent enough of my life inside rooms with federal seals on the door. I'm not interested in spending more of it there voluntarily, even to win. Ashwood herself was placed under internal review for the original scheduling decision and the leak that followed it. She was reassigned to a desk role 2 states away, not fired outright. A resolution with enough nuance in it that nobody involved called it a clean victory. Tobias Marchetti, for his part, was quietly moved to a different regional office within a month. Not disciplined exactly, but not thanked either. The kind of transfer that told anyone paying attention exactly how welcome his honesty had turned out to be. That same week, for the first time, Ezra told Silas everything. Not the shape of it, but the whole thing. Sitting across the kitchen table with the old leather notebook open between them for the first time in years. His name was Hollis. He was a mall security guard. I knew him well enough to know his coffee order and the name of his dog, and none of that made it into any file about what happened to him. Ezra turned a page slowly. I want you to know that part of him too, not just the part that ended up in an investigation. Was it your fault? I've asked myself that question for 7 years. Some days the honest answer is no. I did exactly what the rules said to do, and the rules turned out to be wrong, not me. Some days it doesn't feel like it matters which one is technically true, because he's still gone either way. Ezra closed the notebook. I'm giving you the real version now because you've earned it, not the smaller one I built to keep you from worrying, not because I need you to fix anything for me. What was he like? Not the file version, the real one. He kept a photo of his dog taped inside his locker and asked me every single time I saw him whether the Bureau let people bring a K9 partner home once it retired. He liked bad coffee and terrible puns, and he called everybody chief, including me, including the actual chiefs. He wasn't famous for anything. He just showed up every shift and did the work nobody else wanted to do at 2 in the morning, and he was kind to me on days I didn't especially deserve it. Ezra's voice caught slightly. That's the part that never makes it into a report. I want it to make it into what you remember of him instead. I don't think it was your fault. I know I'm getting closer to believing that myself, some days more than others. Talking about him like this instead of just carrying it alone helps more than I expected it to. Silas reached over and put his hand flat on the closed notebook, the way his father sometimes did without noticing. Can I read it someday? The whole thing, not just the parts you tell me. Someday, when you're old enough that reading it won't scare you more than it teaches you. Ezra covered his son's hand with his own. I'll know when that day is. I'm usually right about timing. In the weeks that followed, Ezra rebuilt what the 6 weeks had cost him 1 contract at a time, slower than he would have liked, faster than he'd feared. 2 of the 3 venues that had canceled came back with apologies attached to new bookings. The 3rd never called again, and Ezra decided he didn't especially want the work of a company that only wanted him once the risk was gone. Bridget Doyle sent a card at Christmas with nothing written inside it but her office number and the words, "Call if you ever need me again, though I hope you won't." Tobias Marchetti stayed in touch longer than either of them expected, the 2 of them meeting for coffee every few months. An unlikely friendship built out of the one morning neither of them had been where they were supposed to be. 6 months later, Ezra stood in the empty exhibition hall of a different convention center an hour before doors opened on a different job fair, running a final check on a PA system he'd rigged the day before. A new event coordinator, younger than him by a decade, found him coiling cable near the east exit. "You're not required to say anything," she said, half joking, clearly having heard some version of the Harborview story secondhand. "I'd just like to know if there's anything worth noticing before we open the doors." Ezra looked out over the rows of half-built booths, empty for 1 more hour, ordinary in every way that mattered. "There's always something worth noticing," he said. "That's the whole job." He clipped the last cable into place and glanced toward the doors, where Silas was waiting with a book and a folding chair, exactly where he'd asked to be. "Some days it's nothing. Most days it's nothing. You still have to look, because you don't get to know in advance which day it isn't." The coordinator laughed, not quite sure if he was joking, and went back to her clipboard. He walked over to where Silas sat, book open on his knees, unbothered by the noise of setup happening around him. "You good over here?" "I'm good. Can I help with anything?" "You can hand me the gaff tape when I need it. That's a real job, not a pretend one." "I know, you've told me that before." I'll probably tell you again. Some things are worth repeating until they stick. Ezra crouched down to his son's eye level for a moment. Thanks for coming with me today. Where else would I be? Ezra didn't have a good answer for that, and didn't need one. He clipped his headset on, checked the levels one more time, and let the empty hall fill with the low, ordinary hum of a system working exactly the way it was supposed to.